Hi everyone, and welcome back to this week's Woman2Woman reflection. Well, we began a new study last week. We talked about the spiritual battle that is going on around us that we cannot see, but that we need to be prepared and we need to be aware of it. Last week I encouraged you to pray and ask God to reveal the weapon that you need for this year, the weapon that God has given you to help you stand tall when the enemy comes at you, when he comes at you and tries to accuse you, when he comes and lies at you, when he shouts accusations or makes you feel less than. Then you have your weapon of choice. You have God's word, you have God's peace, you have your godly armour. You know, 2 Corinthians says in chapter 10 that we don't wage war with the weapons that the world uses. You know, the world uses guns and knives and drugs and the tongue to bring people down, to accuse people, to lie, to discredit, to falsely accuse, to speak negativity and toxic words over you. But as we know that the power of life and death is in the tongue, and we can use the tongue wisely. We can speak life-affirming, life-giving, encouraging words over each other and into our own lives. We can use this weapon for good and not for harm. So maybe you've had a tough week. Maybe there's been a few giants that you've come up against this week that have spoke negativity into your life or spoken toxic words over you, attacked you, accused you, mocked you. Well, there's a story in the Bible, and it's from the Old Testament in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and it's a great story that I used to read to my young son at bedtime. It's the story of a young shepherd boy who found himself in battle. Yes, David was a shepherd boy, and his skills were in tending his sheep and caring for his sheep, but in doing that he'd fought off bears. He'd protected those lambs and those sheep with all of his might. And then one day, he took his place on the battlefield. He stepped up to the battlefield. The enemy at the time was the Philistine army, and they were coming against the Israelites. And they had a big weapon, and that was Goliath the giant. And no one had been able to defeat Goliath until David came along. And David told them, I'm going into battle with Goliath. And King Saul was like, no, you can't do this, you're just a wee guy. But David's like, I'm doing this. And Saul tries to put on David his armour. He tries to put on David his armour, his helmet, give him his sword. And David tried it out. But here's the thing, that wasn't designed for David. That's not the weapon that God had given David to use. That wasn't the armour that God had placed upon David. David had other weapons. The most important weapon that he had was the Spirit of God who was with him. And David went into the battle, not wearing Saul's armour, but just with his little shepherd's bag, his sling and his stones, something that he was used to using. And he came up against the Philistine giant Goliath. And the giant, accused him and shouted at him and mocked him and ridiculed him. And David looked at the giant and thought, you come at me with your sword, but I come with the power of God. And David took his sling and his stones and you know the story. He hit Goliath in the head and he went down. And the enemy was defeated. The enemy was silenced. No longer was able to accuse, no longer was able to throw accusations, no longer was able to ridicule, no longer was able to speak negativity or toxic words over David. Because David did it God's way. He did it using the weapons in which God had given him. And most importantly, he knew that God was with him. What makes me smile about this story was the end though. When the enemy was defeated, David walked over to the giant and he picked up that sword that the enemy tried to wave at David, that sword that the enemy pointed at him and ridiculed him with. And he took the enemy's sword, and it was the enemy's sword that David used to take off his head. If you're tuning in today and you're finding yourself up against a giant, don't wage war the way the world does. The Spirit of God is in you. God is with you. He is fighting your battles for you. You don't need to fight as the world. So choose your weapons wisely and let God's presence lead you to victory. Until next time, God bless.